Hot Rod Creeps was designed by Matt Hyra and published by Cryptozoic Games as a racing game where players are, well, hot rods, racing through a custom-made course made by the players by playing cards or nitroing around the course while trying to avoid hazards and upgrading their racers, all to be the first to reach the finish line. I am not the biggest fan of racing games. I enjoy racing games, but the vast majority of the time that I see one, it's just go from point A to point B and be the first one there. And not much happens along the way that's interesting. It's kind of like stock car racing, where I just want to watch the beginning and the end. But the middle part, I just tune out because not much happens there. And so I want a game that can hook me and keep me interested throughout the entire race. Is this a game that does that? Let's find out. I thought the gameplay was for the most part good, but not great, and there's 4 reasons why I think that. First of all, the corner tokens that you place on the corners as a warnings to the players, I thought were more of a distraction than an actual threat. Whenever you overshoot a corner, the token tells you to either take 1 damage, meaning discard a card from your hand, or take 2 damage, or destroy an upgrade. Now I know that it can be frustrating to lose a card that you really wanted to play because it has a really cool ability that you wanted to utilize, especially if that was the only card you had in your hand. However, in all the times that I've played this game, whenever somebody sped around the corner, they had more than enough cards in their hand that they could just soak up the damage and still manage to keep what they wanted. Also, if you pass a corner at high speed and it tells you to destroy an upgrade, but you don't have an upgrade, then you don't have to do anything. You can just speed around the corner every time. Now, if you did have an upgrade, it can be sad to be forced to lose it by going around the curve too fast, especially if it's one that you like. But if you don't have any upgrades, you got nothing to worry about. The fact that you can just render one of those corners not a danger at all just by keeping your car clear, and the other 2 just force you to discard 1 or 2 cards, which you can also render useless by keeping your hand full of cards, that kind of just makes the corners barely a distraction, let alone a threat. The hazard tokens I also thought were kind of 50-50. They can only be a threat if you land straight on them, and that heavily depends on how many of those hazards you place on the track. For example, in my very first game of this, we wanted to do a little introductory style game, so we just went with a simple oval and just 2 to 4 hazards around the corners, and so we barely found ourselves getting hit by hazards at all. If you were to fill the track with hazards, for example in my last game, we filled up the track with hazards, as many as we could, and that did make the hazards fairly threatening because we were constantly at risk of hitting a hazard every single time we played a card. So it does depend on what race you want to have determines how threatening the hazards can be. The hazards themselves are the most threatening in the world. They're usually just take 1 damage, burn a few cards, that type of thing. But when you have a whole bunch of them out on the track at one time, and you have risk of hitting them multiple times throughout the race, they can be a bit threatening. So the hazards can be a bit threatening if you place a good amount of them out on the track. It really does depend on what type of race you want to have. I'm also not sure how well this game scales. Full transparency, I have not played it with 2 or 6 yet. I've played it with 3 through 5, and I think it works great with 3 and 4, and I do think it works good with 5, but that really does depend on how big you make your course. If you play with 5, maybe even 6 players, and you play on a very long track, then you're likely going to end up with a very long game. Now, if you were to play 5 or 6 players on a really short track, that I think would work really well. 4 and 3, I think you could afford to go a bit longer without risking of it being too long. But then again, I do understand that there are a lot of people who like long races and they want a long track to race on. So it just depends on the player group. What kind of race do you want to have? That can kind of determine how best to scale the game. So make sure you have a good race that doesn't go for too long of a time. My biggest problem with the gameplay, however, is that I thought that the Nitro deck was too easy to exploit with not enough risk. The way the Nitro deck works is that if you have at least 1 card in your hand, you can flip over the top card of the Nitro deck and do whatever it says. You often have to suffer a penalty for it, but that is either burn a bunch of cards off of your deck or take a certain amount of damage, and you get to move a lot faster. For some, burning cards or taking damage is a fair trade-off for being able to move 7, 8, or 9 spaces down the track, especially considering as long as you have at least one card in your hand, there is nothing stopping you from being able to use the Nitro deck over the course of multiple turns in a row. Other than losing some cards from your hand or from your tank, or possibly destroying one of your upgrades, the only real risk when it comes to using the Nitro deck is drawing one of 3 cards that prevents you from moving. That does open up the potential of players exploiting the Nitro deck by having it be their only way of moving. That being said, the game does try to balance the effectiveness of the Nitro deck because, yes, when you use it, you're going to go a lot faster than your standard deck of cards. However, you're also going to be burning a lot of cards or taking a lot of damage, meaning you're going to be going through your deck very fast. And don't forget, your deck is your gas tank, so the faster you go through your gas tank, the sooner you're going to have to hope that you make it to a pit stop, or you're going to have to go back to the last pit stop, or even back to the start of the race if you didn't make it to the first one. So the game does try its best to keep the Nitro deck balanced, but I wonder if it could have been balanced a little bit more. Maybe if you had the possibility of having more of a 25% chance of drawing a card that prevents you from moving might help a little bit more, or if you were to draw a Nitro card and it lets you move but it forces you to discard a little bit more cards. The most cards that it forces you to discard is 9, and I wondered maybe if the amount that it forces you to discard was a bit higher, like if they ranged from maybe 10 to 12, if that might have made the Nitro deck balance a little bit more, but that's just what I think. With all that negativity out of the way, there is so much about the gameplay that I absolutely love. First of all, the ability to customize the track into being anything you want is such a fantastic concept, and I wish more racing games would do it. I have yet to see another racing game that incorporates the concept of being able to design the track however you want. I know that there are other games that do it, I just have yet to see them. More often than not, a racing game will have a single track printed on the board. Maybe if you're lucky, you'll have an alternate track printed on the other side, but even so, that's at max 2 tracks to play on, and if you wanted to have a different experience, you would have to buy expansion maps, but not here. Hot Rod Creeps allows you to design a track so that you can run a race however you want it to be. You want a long race, you can design a long track. If you want a short oval course, you can do that. You want a long road course, go right ahead. You want a short road course, go right ahead. You design the track however you want, and that's going to give you a different racing experience every single time you play through. I also love the fact that there are upgrades in this game and that you aren't just a generic car racing around the track. You have ways to customize your car and make yourself more unique to the way you like to race, which in turn opens up opportunities to have different playstyles from game to game. If you want to be someone who just focuses on speed and just dealing with everything that comes your way, you can grab yourself an engine and some wheels. If you want to be more of the aggressive type that is just about getting up to the front and slowing others down, you can grab a weapon and some wheels. If you want to have more control about how you maneuver your racer around, then you can grab yourself a pit crew. There's just multiple ways of having your racer go around the course, which opens up a whole new level of replay value, which I'll get to later on. In addition to that, the way you can play the cards also opens up different avenues of play styles. If you want to be a more aggressive type and throw caution into the wind, you can repeatedly go Nitro. If you're more cautious and you want to have more control about how you maneuver through the track to avoid all the hazards or the corners or the other players, you can play cards from your hand. Not to mention, the teams themselves have their own play styles. They're not just a player board that you use to keep track of your upgrades. They actually have a style of which they like to be played. For example, Rockability wants to flip the top card of their deck as many times as possible because they have more cards that affect them if they play from the top of their deck than any other team. Food Fight wants to play their cards cars in a sequence of even odd, even odd. Monsters want to get cards out of their deck as quickly as possible, but they want to maintain their deck somewhere between half empty and completely empty because they have cards that can affect them if they're in that range. So there is more to the teams than just having a plain player board. Overall, in terms of the gameplay, I did think there were some things that could have been done better. I thought the corners could have been more threatening. The nitro could have been a bit more balanced, at least in my opinion. The hazard tokens were a bit 50-50, but I love the fact that you could customize the race to be however you want. I love the fact that you could have those upgrades, that you could mix and mingle with those upgrades to customize your racer, that there's different ways that you can play the cards depending on what type of racer you are. Overall, despite the issues that I did find, I do think that the gameplay works fairly well. When it comes to the replay value, there is replay galore. Like I said, the ability to customize the track to make it look like anything you want is fantastic. I also thought that there was a good variety of road hazards, and the best part about those road hazards is that they can be placed anywhere, and you can place as many of them on the track as you want. So if you want to have a more standard race, you could put less on them. If you want a more hardcore race, you could put more on them. It all depends on how much you want to have outside factors affecting your racers. I also love that there were 4 types of upgrades, with each upgrade having a different purpose. The engines let you go faster. The weapons let you attack others. The wheels gives you a benefit whenever you draft. The pit cruise gives you a benefit when you stop at the pit stop. And I love the fact that there are different varieties in each of those types. You can have a different type of weapon each time, or a different type of wheel, or a different type of pit crew, and a mix and match of all the different types. And there's so many good combinations that you can create. It allows you to customize your racer according to your playstyle. Speaking of playstyles, you can also change the way you play the game by how you play the cards from your hand, or the nitro deck, or a combination of the such. Plus, the fact that each team has its own playstyle that you can choose to play as. You don't have to play as it, but it has its own style of play that you can choose to. It can create situations where somebody is going to set up the game and you're looking at them like, ooh, let me have that monster one. It does make a difference on which team you play. With a massive amount of customization to the track, customization to your racers, multiple different play styles to choose from, and unique teams to play through, this game has immense replay value. When it comes to how easy the game is to learn to play, this game is very simple. On your turn, you can play a card from your hand, flip the top card of your deck. If you have at least one card in your hand, you can flip over the top card of the nitrous deck, or you can draw 2 cards. There's a tiny bit of complexity when it comes to movement, particularly with the keywords hand only and flip only, where you only get the benefits of those cards depending on how you play them, which has led to a bit of confusion at first, but after you do it a few times, it should be much easier to understand. If you speed past the corner at the speed on the token or higher, you suffer the penalty. Land on a hazard token, suffer the penalty. Land in a pit stop, either refill your tank or draw an upgrade. I thought the rulebook was helpful, but I did find 2 issues with it. First of all, it does not have an example of a setup game in the rulebook. It just has the starting grid and then instructions on how to set it up. The book does try to compensate for you by having a few sample courses toward the back of the rulebook that you can base your track on, or maybe use that as a starting point to build your track and then go out from there. There's also one great section toward the back that gives you a guide on how many tiles you want to use to build your track, depending on how many players you have and how long you want the race to be. If you want there to be a little short race, you can have a maximum of 20 tiles. If you want a more long race, you can have a max of 40 tiles, as it recommends. It also has a section that can give you guidance and suggestions on how far you want your pit stops to be, depending on how hard you want the race to be. If you want it to be an easier race, you can have one one be every 6 or 7 tiles. If you want it to be a harder race, you could have one every 11 to 14 tiles. It all depends on how hard you want the race to be. The other issue I had with the rulebook is that for some reason they decided to have it where they explain one concept of the gameplay on one page, but then not have an example of that concept explained until several pages later. For example, on page 5 of the rulebook, it talks about the action of flipping the top card of your deck, doing what it says, and then drafting. But it doesn't have an example of that action taking place until page 9. Only then do they actually go through an example of flipping the card, taking the action, drafting, as well as the abilities of a few upgrade cards. And the thing of it is that one example on page 9 is the only example of gameplay for the entire rulebook. I don't know if they were worried about it clogging up with examples, so they decided to just have one page dedicated to the example and use that one page to explain as many concepts as possible, rather than having a small example after each section. But it's a lot more confusing to me why they couldn't have just a sentence or two at the end of each section as an example to perform each action. Other than those two parts though, I thought the rulebook was very helpful. It explained the player actions very well. It explained the distinction between the burn effect and the damage effect, which is what you're going to be doing throughout the game. It explains the corners very nicely. It has a good section on what you want to do on whenever you run out of gas. It does a good job at explaining what you can do at a pit stop, as well as what each of the various upgrades do. It explains the road hazards. It has a section to explain each hazard in more detail so you can figure that out. There's also a section that's supposed to teach you how to play through the game as a circuit, meaning if you want to play multiple races over the course of a few sessions, it's supposed to teach you how to do that and how to score. Personally, I have not done that yet, so I can't really say how easy that portion is, but I do want to let you know that that exists. So far, I have not had any questions about the rulebook that the rulebook could not explain, and then I would have to make up house rules on the fly. I have never had that issue, so in terms of how easy the game is to learn and to play, I would say it's very easy. When it comes to the aesthetics of the game, I thought there were some good aspects, but there are some things that bother me. For starters, the puzzle track pieces are not the easiest to take apart. Now, I understand why they did it that way, because they don't want to make it so where if you accidentally were to bump the table and the track shifts, it splits apart and you have to spend a few minutes fixing the track. It just makes it a bit of a hassle to take apart. Thankfully though, when it comes to the tracks, you should easily be able to figure out which ones belong to the pit stops. It does have a easy to read text showing the name on the tiles. Also, the Ring of Fire standee, as cool as it looks, it is completely impractical considering the fact that they just included a token to represent the Ring of Fire space, not to mention the fact that the Ring of Fire standee barely stands up, if ever, or at least mine does. I cannot get this thing to stand upright whenever I use it. Also, you included the standee for the Ring of Fire, but not the Shark Tank, really? Other than that, I thought the aesthetics were for the most part fine. The corner tokens and the hazard tokens are fairly thin, but I think they're still stable, so you shouldn't have to worry too much about bending them by accident. The text on the corners and the hazards are also very easy to read, so you shouldn't have any issues with that. I love the fact that the racers were clear blocks rather than just cheap standees. I was a little bit bothered by the fact that I had to put stickers on the blocks to actually have them be the racers, but thankfully the stickers are small enough that they have plenty of space for you to actually put them on without risking them going over the edge, which makes them look ugly. I also thought that the cards themselves were laid out well for the most part. The numbers on the movement cards and the nitro cards is very easy to read, so that shouldn't be an issue for you. The text is also a good size on the nitro cards, but the movement cards is a little bit problematic. 3 of them in particular, the Battle Wizards, the Aliens, and Food Fight, has their text over a light colored background, so if you are colorblind, there is a possibility that you could have a hard time reading those 3 decks. That is something you will need to keep in mind. The other 3 decks though are fine. You shouldn't have any issues with reading them. So overall, in terms of the aesthetics, there are some small things that I question their decisions on and would have changed myself, but I still think the aesthetics are fine. When it comes to thematic ties, I actually thought that the game managed to tie its mechanics to the theme fairly well. There is some some thematic disconnect to it. For example, the hot rod portion of the theme, that's just purely pasted on. It was just put there for flavor. I also didn't really think that the upgrade cards tied in very well, nor the tie-in of how you draft in front of somebody whenever you land on them. Other than that, I actually thought that the theme worked pretty well. Your deck of cards is your gas tank, and the more cards you draw from your deck, the more gas you're using. And if you completely run out of cards, you've run out of gas and have to go all the way back to the pit stop in order to refill. Of course, in a real race, you wouldn't be able to make it back to a pit stop if you just simply ran out of gas. That's a bit of a thematic disconnect, but I'd rather have a bit of a disconnect than just say, if you ran out of cards, you're out of the game. Also, using a nitro card, it's likely to damage or even immobilize your vehicle, but if you use the nitro, you're likely to go faster. Also, if you sped around a corner too fast, you're gonna hit the corner and you're gonna take damage to your vehicle, just like how it would happen in a real race. So overall, in terms of the theme, there is some disconnected portions of it, but it's not enough for me to really say that it's a completely pasted on theme. It does have some good tie-ins with the mechanics. Overall, this game actually surprised me quite a bit, and I enjoyed it quite a bit. The gameplay was, for the most part, pretty good, and I actually had fun playing it. The replay value is immense, and it will keep you interested in wanting to come back and re-look at it. The game is incredibly easy to learn. It may take a while to play. It depends on how many players you have and how big you want to make the course. So that is something you will need to keep in mind. The aesthetics are for the most part okay, and despite some disconnects thematically, I still thought the theme actually worked fairly well. All of that coming together into a satisfying experience that I do enjoy playing. If you're someone out there who is looking for a racing game that is more than just go around the track, first to the finish line wins, then this might be one I'd recommend you look into. I'm going to give Hot Rod Creeps a 7 out of 10. So those are all my thoughts on Hot Rod Creeps. With all that said, I want to know, what are your thoughts on this game? Let me know in the comments. I hope you all enjoyed this video. If you did, give it a big thumbs up. If you want more reviews or if you want more videos, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more tutorials, reviews, and unboxings. Thank you all as always so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.